By 1913, thanks largely to the tireless efforts of the Anti-Saloon League and the WCTU, Georgia and Oklahoma had joined Maine and North Dakota and passed laws restricting liquor statewide. So had Kansas, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia. The brewers and distillers were suffering. County by county, state by state, they were being forced to close down. But they still believed that any kind of national restriction on alcohol was impossible because the United States government was so dependent on the taxes they paid. Then, for the liquor industry, the unthinkable happened. In early 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, authorizing the federal government to impose an income tax. The Anti-Saloon League had helped bring it about, shrewdly allying itself with progressives and populists who favored the redistribution of wealth. The government would no longer have to rely on alcohol to fund its operations.
The prohibitionists knew that they could never, ever have prohibition until they could find something to substitute for the tax collections that came through the excise tax. So therefore, they supported the income tax.
Prohibition is no longer a local issue, warned the American Brewers Review. Prohibition is now a national danger. The Anti-Saloon League pounced. The time is now, it said.
We therefore declare for alcohol's national annihilation by an amendment to the federal Constitution which shall forever prohibit throughout the territory of the United States the manufacture and sale and the importation, exportation, and transportation of intoxicating liquor to be used as a beverage.
On December 10th, 1913, the citizens of Washington, D.C. saw something they had rarely seen before: a mass march sweeping toward the Capitol. Two parallel streams of people, several hundred women representing the WCTU, and 1,000 men, members of the Anti-Saloon League. They were there to demand a prohibition amendment to the United States Constitution. A number of other countries were also considering prohibition statutes, but these marchers wanted an amendment rather than a mere law, because if they succeeded, the prohibition of alcohol would be enshrined in the Constitution of the United States forever. No amendment had ever been repealed.
From the earliest days, the Constitution came to be seen by Americans as something much more than what the people who wrote it imagined it would be. It was not just a framework for government, but it came to be seen as capturing the values and ideals that were essential to what made a person an American.
The same day as the March on the Capitol, Senator Morris Shepherd of Texas sponsored an 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, prohibition. Representative Richmond P. Hobson of Alabama introduced it in the House. Enacting it would be a tall order. They would need to win 2/3 of the House and Senate before the amendment could be submitted to the legislatures of the 48 states, and then would need to persuade 36 of them to ratify it.
They had to get it passed before 1920, because in 1920, there was going to be a new census. And when the census changed, the cities, which were the wet part of the country, were going to have more representation in Congress, and the small towns were going to have less representation in Congress.
In 1914, Dries won a first vote in the House, 197 to 190. Nowhere near the 2/3 they needed, but a serious sign of which way the wind was blowing. It was clear that millions of Americans had now come to support prohibition for all sorts of reasons. Democrats as well as Republicans, progressives as well as conservatives, free thinkers as well as churchgoers. Some of the richest industrialists in the country, including Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, backed prohibition because they believed alcohol undercut the output of their workers. The radical industrial workers of the world were for it too, because they thought alcohol was part of a capitalist plot to weaken the working man. So was Booker T. Washington, because he believed alcohol undermined black progress, while hundreds of thousands of Southern whites supported it as well, in part because they believed alcohol turned black people into brutes.
There was a lot in the temperance movement and the prohibition movement that was really temperance and prohibition for somebody else. It was the peak of Jim Crow and the prohibition movement in the South. Much of it was fear of this double combination, the scariest thing to a white Southern racist, a black man with a ballot in one hand and a bottle in the other hand. And they would do anything to keep the black man from having either one.
Meanwhile, the Anti-Saloon League intensified its efforts, sending some 50,000 trained speakers into the field, collecting tens of thousands of signatures on petitions, working to defeat any senator or congressman unwilling to offer unqualified support for the amendment, and dispatching secret operatives to infiltrate the opposition and ferret out its plans. 8 more states passed dry laws: Virginia, Arkansas, Alabama, Nebraska, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Arizona. Because of local option laws already on the books, more than half the American people now found themselves living under some version of prohibition. Many of the state laws still permitted package stores to sell liquor for home consumption. It was the saloon the dries were after, and most Americans went along, certain any national law wouldn't really affect them. President Woodrow Wilson found himself trapped between the two wings of his Democratic Party, the wet cities of the East and Midwest, and the very dry South and West. In part to placate the dries, he had appointed Josephus Daniels, a teetotaling North Carolina newspaperman, as Secretary of the Navy. Daniels promptly banished alcohol from the entire fleet. Wilson's Secretary of State was a far more celebrated champion of prohibition, William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska, 3 times a failed candidate for president.
He was a progressive populist. His enemies called him the fundamentalist pope. He, at first, was a temperance guy, but not a prohibitionist. And I think that it's fair to say that he saw which way the movement was going. And when he saw that there was a possibility of a prohibition amendment, he jumped into the front of it because he was this major figure in the United States.
On April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson traveled to Capitol Hill to ask Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. The Great War had begun in Europe almost 3 years earlier, and over the intervening months, German submarines had sunk American vessels and enraged the American public. The war and the anti-German propaganda produced by the Wilson administration's newly created Committee on Public Information set off a wave of hysteria about Germans and German Americans. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Dachshunds were stoned to death. School children destroyed their German textbooks, and an Illinois mob lynched an American citizen whose only crime had been speaking German over a neighbor's fence. The frenzied atmosphere was a disaster for the German-American brewers, and tailor-made for Wayne Wheeler and the Anti-Saloon League.
There's an office of the government that is created to propagandize and to build up hatred for all things German. Well, to the prohibitionists, this was the home run. This is the thing that they needed to finally win.
We have German enemies across the water, but we have German enemies in this country, too. And the worst of all our German enemies, the most treacherous, the most menacing, are Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller.
Wayne Wheeler persuaded the Senate to investigate links between the Brewers and the German-American alliance, which had trumpeted the German cause until the moment America entered the war. Wheeler would see to it that beer and treason were now linked in the public mind. The Anti-Saloon League immediately called for a temporary wartime ban on the sale of precious grain to brewers and distillers, and eventually saw it passed by both houses. For the first time in history, every American was subject to federal restrictions on alcohol. There had been 1,000 American breweries before the United States entered the war. Within months, half would be out of business. Meanwhile, Wayne Wheeler was at work behind the scenes, determined to seize the moment and win adoption of the Prohibition Amendment. Boys Penrose, the formidable Republican boss of Pennsylvania and one of the Senate's leading wets, mindful that passage of the amendment in Congress was inevitable, threatened to mount a filibuster unless the Dries agreed to a time limit for ratification by the states. They would have 6 years, no more. Penrose was sure that 36 states would never be able to ratify the amendment in the time allotted. But to the surprise of the wets, Wheeler agreed to the limit. The Senate voted in favor of the amendment on August 1st, 1917. Afterwards, convinced they had outwitted Wheeler and the Dries, the wets went out for a celebratory drink. The final House version of the bill allowed the Dry forces 7 years to achieve ratification. The wets still remained confident that it would never happen. When the vote in the House came on December 18th, Wayne Wheeler was watching from the gallery.
One of his opponents said they would look up to him as if he were the Roman consul. Was he going thumbs up or thumbs down? And they would vote the way that he told them to vote. No matter what your position was on other issues, if you were not okay with Wayne Wheeler, you were in trouble.
The amendment passed the House easily, 282 to 128, and was sent to the states for ratification. The Anti-Saloon League and their allies had only 84 months to convince more than 5,000 legislators in 36 states to ratify. They would do it in less than 13. On January 16, 1919, Nebraska, the home of William Jennings Bryan, became the 36th state to ratify the 18th Amendment. It would go into effect 1 year later.